Some people believe a shortcut is harmless until they discover it crosses somebody else's life. The first thing I heard that morning was not the wind rolling across my ranch or the familiar call of meadowlarks greeting the sunrise. It was the crunch of expensive tires cutting across my private gravel trail where no public road had ever existed. I set down my coffee mug on the porch railing and watched a white luxury sport utility vehicle emerge through a cloud of golden dust, weaving between weathered fence posts that my father and grandfather had planted decades before I inherited the land. The smell of fresh hay drifted through the cool Texas air while the rising sun painted long shadows across thousands of acres of open pasture. Everything about the morning felt peaceful except for the vehicle driving as though my ranch were part of someone else's neighborhood. I climbed into my old pickup truck and followed the trail at an easy pace until I reached the northern gate leading toward the grazing fields. By the time I arrived, the driver had already stopped beside the cattle fence and stepped out wearing a perfectly pressed pastel blazer while holding a leather clipboard under one arm. She looked more annoyed than surprised to see me. "You really should keep this road in better condition," she said without introducing herself. I stared at her for a moment before looking beyond the fence where Titan, my largest breeding bull, stood quietly beneath a sprawling live oak tree chewing grass with complete indifference to the conversation taking place several hundred feet away. Titan weighed well over 2,000 pounds, yet anyone who respected the fences and warning signs had absolutely nothing to fear from him. Every gate around his pasture had been professionally maintained, every boundary clearly marked, and every visitor who asked permission was safely escorted through the property. The problem had never been the bull. The problem was people who believed private land somehow became public because it saved them 10 minutes on the drive home. The woman finally extended her hand. Linda Crawford, President of the Homeowners Association. I introduced myself as Cole Bennett and explained that the gravel road beneath her tires belonged to my family's ranch, not the subdivision beyond the hills. She smiled politely, almost dismissively, and told me residents had been using this shortcut for years. According to her, everyone considered it the fastest route between the neighborhood entrance and the county highway. I glanced toward the deep tire tracks cutting through the pasture entrance and quietly replied that convenience had never rewritten a property deed. She folded her arms and insisted I could not simply block a road that so many people depended on. I looked back toward the steel ranch gate standing open beside the fence and then toward Titan still grazing peacefully beyond another secure enclosure. "Actually," I answered, "I can close my own gate whenever I choose." Her expression changed instantly. What she saw as a shortcut, I saw as the front yard my family had protected for 3 generations. Less than an hour later I closed the gate, locked it, and fastened a brand new sign that read Private Ranch Road. No trespassing. As I tightened the final bolt beneath the warm Texas sun, I noticed Linda standing beside her vehicle making a phone call while staring directly at me. Something told me she was not calling to apologize. The sound of Linda's sport utility vehicle faded beyond the hills, but the uneasy feeling stayed with me long after the dust settled back onto the gravel road. I had lived on this ranch for 46 years, and one lesson never changed no matter how many seasons passed. Trouble almost never arrived all at once. It started with one assumption that nobody challenged until it became someone else's expectation. My family had raised cattle on these rolling Texas pastures for 3 generations. My grandfather bought the first section of land shortly after returning home from military service, carrying little more than determination and a worn county survey rolled inside a leather tube. My father spent decades expanding the ranch one pasture at a time, repairing fences with his own hands, digging stock ponds during dry summers, and planting live oaks that now stretched high enough to cast afternoon shade across the grazing fields. By the time ownership passed to me, I understood every creek crossing, every limestone ridge, every cattle guard, and every gate as naturally as most people recognize the streets in their own neighborhood. My mornings always followed the same rhythm. Before sunrise I brewed coffee strong enough to wake the entire county, pulled on worn leather boots, and drove the old pickup across miles of pasture while checking water troughs, windmills, mineral feeders, and fences before the Texas heat settled over the land. Titan usually greeted me near the northern pasture where he calmly watched the herd with quiet confidence. Despite his enormous size, he was remarkably predictable because animals respected boundaries far better than many people did. Visitors who asked permission admired him safely from behind secure fencing, while school groups occasionally stopped by during agricultural education events. Every fence surrounding his pasture exceeded county safety recommendations because protecting both livestock and visitors had always mattered more than convenience. That was exactly why Linda's attitude bothered me so deeply. She had looked directly at multiple warning signs without seeing any reason they should apply to her. Later that afternoon I unfolded the original ranch deed across my dining room table beneath the same antique ceiling fan my father installed decades earlier. The paper had yellowed with age, but every legal description remained perfectly clear. The gravel road leading through the northern pasture had never been dedicated as a public road, never transferred to another owner, and never removed from the ranch boundary. It existed for one purpose only, allowing ranch vehicles to move livestock safely between seasonal grazing fields. Outside the kitchen window I could hear the steady clinking of windmill blades turning in the afternoon breeze while Titan grazed peacefully beneath the distant oak trees exactly where he belonged. Looking across those familiar pastures, I realized this disagreement had never been about saving anyone a few extra minutes during the drive home. It was about whether years of repeated trespassing could somehow replace the words written on a legally recorded deed. Deep down I already knew the answer, but something told me Linda believed confidence carried more authority than county records, and I had a feeling the next conversation would not happen beside a quiet ranch gate. The following morning I drove toward the subdivision instead of waiting for another unexpected visitor to appear at my gate. I wanted to understand why so many people believed crossing private ranch land had become completely normal. The neighborhood looked exactly like thousands of others scattered across suburban Texas. Freshly cut lawns shimmered beneath the morning sun. Sprinklers clicked methodically across green grass while delivery trucks rolled quietly between rows of well-kept homes. Children waited beside decorative mailboxes for the school bus, and neighbors waved politely as they walked their dogs along clean sidewalks lined with flowering trees. Nothing about the community suggested conflict. In fact, everything looked peaceful enough that someone passing through would never imagine a private ranch road connected the entire neighborhood to the county highway. I parked near the community clubhouse and introduced myself to several residents standing outside with coffee cups in hand. Almost every conversation followed the same pattern. They explained they had always used the gravel road because previous residents used it before them. Some believed the road belonged to the county. Others assumed the homeowners association owned it. A few admitted they had never questioned its ownership because the route had simply existed for as long as they remembered. None of them spoke with hostility. Most seemed genuinely surprised when I explained that the road remained part of my family's ranch according to the recorded deed. That surprised me even more. It became increasingly clear that the real misunderstanding had been passed from one homeowner to the next until assumption slowly replaced fact. My meeting with Linda later that afternoon confirmed exactly where the problem had started. She welcomed me into the homeowners association office with the same polished confidence she had displayed beside my ranch gate. Neatly organized binders covered the conference table, and framed photographs of neighborhood events decorated the walls behind her desk. She explained that the shortcut reduced traffic around the main entrance and helped residents reach the county highway much faster. I listened patiently before placing a certified copy of my property survey beside her clipboard. She barely glanced at it before sliding it back across the table. Instead, she pointed towards several printed neighborhood maps showing the shortcut highlighted in bright color. According to her, repeated community use had made the route part of everyday neighborhood life. I quietly asked whether she possessed a recorded easement, a county dedication, or any legal document granting public access across my ranch. For the first time since we met, she hesitated. The silence lasted only a few seconds before she answered that the homeowners association attorneys had assured the board everything was in order. It was not the confident answer she believed it to be. Experience had taught me that people relying on solid legal documents usually produce them immediately. People relying on assumptions often refer to conversations instead of records. As I stepped back outside, the warm breeze carried the familiar scent of cedar and fresh grass from the ranch beyond the subdivision. Looking toward the distant pasture where Titan grazed quietly behind secure fencing, I realized the bull had never been the true warning waiting at the end of that shortcut. The real warning had always been written inside county records that nobody had bothered to read before deciding someone else's private road belonged to everyone. 2 days later the certified letter arrived exactly where I expected it to, tucked inside my mailbox between a livestock supply catalog and the weekly county newspaper. The envelope carried the return address of the Homeowners Association law firm, and before I even broke the seal I could already guess what it contained. The letter demanded that I immediately reopen the shortcut and remove every obstacle restricting what they described as established neighborhood access. They claimed my actions created unnecessary inconvenience for residents and requested that I voluntarily restore traffic across the ranch while the matter was being reviewed. I carried the letter back to the porch, poured another cup of coffee, and read every line twice while listening to the steady creaking of the old windmill turning above the southern pasture. Not once did the document include a recorded easement number, a county dedication, or any legal description proving they possessed the right to cross my property. It simply repeated that the road had been used for many years. That afternoon my attorney visited the ranch carrying a portable scanner, several county plats, and copies of every deed recorded against the property since my grandfather first purchased the land. We spread everything across the long wooden table inside the ranch office where faded photographs of earlier generations watched from the walls. The room smelled faintly of leather, cedar, and old paper as sunlight streamed through wide windows overlooking the northern pasture. Together we compared every legal description line by line. The shortcut appeared repeatedly on aerial photographs, but ownership never changed. The gravel road remained exactly where it had always been, entirely inside the legal boundary of the Bennett Ranch. More importantly, every recorded easement we located involved utility companies, drainage improvements, or temporary construction activity. Nothing granted unrestricted public travel through the ranch. My attorney quietly smiled before closing the final binder. He explained that long use alone did not automatically erase private ownership, especially when clear boundaries, maintained fences, and continuous control over the property had always existed. The next morning I drove the entire length of the ranch road with a maintenance trailer behind my pickup. Fresh reflective signs were installed at every entrance stating private ranch property, authorized access only, and livestock area beyond this point. Every sign matched county recommendations for visibility and placement. I also replaced aging fence boards near Titan's pasture and inspected every latch twice to make certain the livestock enclosure remained secure. Titan watched from the opposite side of the fence with his usual calm confidence, occasionally lifting his head before returning to the fresh grass beneath the oak trees. He never approached the roadway because the fencing system had been designed specifically to separate livestock from vehicle traffic. Late that afternoon I noticed several neighborhood residents slowing their vehicles before reaching the closed gate. Instead of attempting to drive around it, many simply turned toward the main entrance without complaint after reading the new signs. They seemed more curious than frustrated. Linda, however, reacted differently. She stepped out of her sport utility vehicle, studied every warning sign in complete silence, and then carefully photographed each one before making another phone call. Watching from across the pasture, I realized the argument had quietly shifted. This was no longer about a convenient shortcut across open land. It had become a question of whether recorded property rights would outweigh years of comfortable assumptions, and for the first time I believed the answer was beginning to speak for itself. The following week the dispute quietly shifted from conversations and warning signs to measurable facts that could no longer be ignored. My attorney arranged a meeting at the county survey office where a licensed surveyor, a title specialist, and a county engineer agreed to review every document connected to the northern ranch entrance. The building smelled of old paper, polished wood, and fresh coffee while oversized maps covered nearly every table inside the conference room. One by one we unfolded certified surveys, historical aerial photographs, subdivision plats, drainage maps, utility records, and the original Bennett Ranch deed that had remained in my family for decades. Modern satellite images were carefully placed over older survey drawings until the entire history of the property stretched across the table like pieces of a puzzle finally beginning to fit together. The county surveyor traced the gravel road with a pencil before comparing it to the earliest recorded boundary map. Every curve matched the original ranch trail my grandfather had used to move cattle between seasonal grazing pastures. The engineer then examined roadway improvements added years later, including gravel, drainage culverts, and roadside grading. Although the road had been upgraded over time, every improvement remained inside the original ranch boundary. Nothing suggested the property had ever been dedicated to public use. The title specialist continued searching through recorded easements, property transfers, and archived filings dating back several decades. Temporary construction agreements appeared. Utility easements serving electric and water companies appeared. Drainage rights protecting stormwater infrastructure appeared. Yet the one document everyone expected to find never surfaced. There was no recorded permanent easement granting unrestricted neighborhood access across the ranch. The silence around the table lasted several seconds before the surveyor finally leaned back and quietly said that assumptions had apparently traveled much farther than the paperwork ever had. My attorney immediately requested certified copies of every relevant record while I looked through the conference room window toward the familiar hills surrounding my ranch. Outside, warm Texas sunlight reflected across distant cedar trees, reminding me that the land itself had never changed. Only people's understanding of it had. That afternoon licensed survey crews arrived at the northern pasture carrying advanced positioning equipment, bright survey flags, measuring poles, and digital mapping instruments. Every corner marker was located, verified, photographed, and compared against historical records. Titan watched calmly from behind the secure livestock fence while occasionally lifting his head toward the activity before returning to graze beneath the old live oak tree. The crews worked carefully around every existing fence, making certain nothing disturbed either the livestock or the natural landscape. As the final measurements were completed near sunset, the lead surveyor handed me a preliminary field report confirming that the entire shortcut, including the section used daily by neighborhood traffic, remained within the legal boundaries of the Bennett Ranch. I folded the report beside my grandfather's original deed and placed both inside the worn leather document case that had traveled through 3 generations of my family. For the first time since Linda drove across my pasture believing convenience carried legal authority, I realized the strongest barrier protecting my ranch would never be the steel gate or even Titan standing peacefully beyond the fence. It would be the quiet certainty of records that had been telling the same story long before anyone decided to create a shortcut through someone else's land. By the time the certified survey became final, every decision I made followed the same principle my grandfather had repeated throughout my childhood. Never let frustration choose the next fence post. Let the facts decide where it belongs. My attorney gathered the completed survey, the title opinion, the county records, and the engineering reports before arranging one final strategy meeting inside the courthouse conference room. Sunlight poured through tall windows onto a table covered with carefully organized maps while the scent of fresh coffee mixed with the smell of old paper and polished wood. The licensed surveyor reviewed every measurement one last time before quietly confirming that the northern ranch road remained entirely within the legal boundary of the Bennett Ranch. The title specialist added that no permanent recorded easement granting unrestricted neighborhood access had been located despite an exhaustive search through decades of county filings. Hearing those conclusions spoken aloud felt strangely peaceful rather than exciting. I had never wanted an argument. I simply wanted the land to be treated the way every other piece of private property deserved to be treated. My attorney then recommended that we preserve the current ranch entrance exactly as it existed while making several additional improvements that emphasized safety rather than confrontation. Within days, contractors installed brighter reflective warning signs, upgraded the locking mechanism on the steel ranch gate, reinforced several sections of livestock fencing, and added clear directional notices explaining that all unauthorized traffic must use the neighborhood's primary public entrance. Every improvement complied with county guidance and respected established property boundaries. Titan continued grazing behind multiple layers of secure fencing, occasionally lifting his head toward the activity before calmly returning to the fresh grass beneath the live oak trees. Watching him reminded me how easily people misunderstood the situation. The safest place on the ranch had always been the place where everyone respected the boundaries already in front of them. Late one afternoon Linda arrived once again, this time accompanied by 2 members of the Homeowners Association board instead of attorneys. They stood quietly outside the closed gate reading every new sign before asking if we could speak without raising voices or making assumptions. We walked a short distance along the fence where I unfolded the certified survey across the hood of my pickup truck. The afternoon breeze carried the scent of cedar and dry grass while distant cattle moved peacefully across the pasture. Linda studied the survey far longer than she had looked at any document during our earlier conversations. For the first time she asked questions instead of making declarations. My attorney carefully explained how property ownership, access rights, and long-term community use were separate legal issues requiring separate recorded documents. Nobody interrupted. Nobody argued. Even the silence felt different because it was finally built upon evidence instead of expectation. As the meeting ended, Linda admitted the board needed to review its assumptions with independent legal counsel before taking another step. She climbed back into her vehicle and slowly drove away using the subdivision's main entrance rather than the ranch road. Watching the dust settle behind her, I realized the strongest change had not happened at the gate, the fence, or even inside the survey records. It had happened the moment everyone finally stopped asking what had always been convenient and started asking what had always been true. The county scheduled a formal mediation before the court considered any additional motions, and for the first time since this entire dispute began, everyone involved sat in the same room with the same stack of certified documents resting on the table between us. The conference room overlooked the courthouse lawn where old oak trees cast long afternoon shadows across neatly trimmed grass. Inside, the air smelled of fresh coffee, paper, and polished wood while every chair remained occupied by surveyors, attorneys, title specialists, county officials, representatives from the Homeowners Association, and Linda Crawford sitting quietly at the end of the table with her familiar leather clipboard resting unopened beside her. My attorney began by presenting the licensed boundary survey followed by the title opinion confirming that no permanent recorded easement granted unrestricted travel across the Bennett Ranch. The county surveyor then displayed historical aerial photographs showing the original ranch trail exactly where the shortcut existed today. Every image, every measurement, and every legal description reinforced the same conclusion. The road had always remained private property regardless of how frequently it had been used. No one raised their voice because there was nothing left to debate emotionally. The discussion gradually shifted away from blame and toward practical solutions. County officials explained that the subdivision already possessed a fully approved public entrance, although it required several additional miles of driving compared with the ranch shortcut. Engineers also outlined a proposal allowing construction of a future connector road entirely outside my property if the Homeowners Association chose to fund it. As those options were discussed, I noticed Linda studying the certified survey far more carefully than she ever had before. She eventually looked across the table and admitted that the board had relied upon years of repeated community practice instead of independently verifying the original property records. Hearing those words did not feel like a personal victory. It felt like the first honest sentence spoken since I had closed the ranch gate weeks earlier. After a short recess, everyone traveled together to the northern entrance so county officials could inspect the property in person. Warm Texas sunlight stretched across the rolling pasture while the breeze carried the familiar scent of cedar, dry grass, and freshly turned soil. Titan grazed peacefully far behind multiple secure fences, occasionally lifting his head before returning to the herd without the slightest interest in the gathering near the gate. One county engineer quietly pointed toward the livestock enclosure and remarked that every warning sign, fence line, and access control exceeded normal safety recommendations for a working ranch. Even Linda nodded after reading each sign carefully. Standing beside the locked gate, I realized the strongest message had never been written on the warning signs themselves. It had always been the respect shown by maintaining them properly year after year. As the inspection concluded, the county mediator summarized the situation with remarkable simplicity. The ranch owner had protected private property responsibly. The homeowners association had relied upon assumptions that were never fully documented. The path forward would require lawful cooperation rather than continued conflict. Watching the final sunlight settle across the gravel road disappearing toward the subdivision, I sensed the shortcut that once divided everyone had quietly become the piece of evidence bringing the entire dispute to an honest conclusion. The weeks that followed the mediation changed the atmosphere around both the ranch and the neighborhood in ways I had never expected. Instead of another stack of legal demands arriving in my mailbox, my attorney received a draft settlement prepared jointly by the homeowners association, county officials, and the subdivision developers. Every proposed change centered on one principle that should have guided the project from the beginning. The legal records had to match the reality on the ground. Construction plans were approved for a permanent connector road that would link the neighborhood directly to the county highway without crossing a single foot of the Bennett Ranch. Engineers returned to the area carrying surveying equipment, utility maps, and roadway designs while construction crews marked the future route with bright orange flags stretching across land that had already been properly acquired for public access. I watched the preparations from the same ridge where my grandfather once counted cattle before sunset. The breeze carried the familiar scent of cedar, fresh soil, and cut grass while heavy equipment worked steadily in the distance. For the first time since I had closed the ranch gate, every vehicle I saw was there because it actually belonged there. A few days later Linda requested another meeting, this time at the community clubhouse instead of the courthouse. The room looked exactly as it had during our first conversation, but the mood could not have been more different. She placed a neatly organized folder on the table before quietly acknowledging that the homeowners association board had voted to withdraw every remaining claim related to the ranch road. She explained that independent legal counsel had confirmed the same conclusions reached by the county surveyor, and the board intended to cooperate fully with construction of the new public connection. There was no dramatic apology, no raised voices, and no attempt to rewrite history. Instead, there was something much more meaningful. There was accountability. Linda admitted that repeated use of the shortcut had gradually convinced everyone that convenience and legality were the same thing, and she accepted that the assumption should have been questioned years earlier. As we walked outside together, several residents approached us carrying questions about the upcoming construction schedule. Many thanked me for remaining patient throughout the dispute, explaining that they had never realized the shortcut crossed private ranch land because previous homeowners had always described it as the normal way home. I assured them that none of my actions had ever been directed at the families living there. My responsibility had always been protecting the ranch while making certain everyone stayed safe, including the people who unknowingly crossed it every day. Looking beyond the clubhouse toward the distant pasture, I could just make out Titan grazing peacefully beneath the broad branches of the old live oak tree. He had never moved from the secure enclosure built specifically for him, and he had never needed to become anything more than a quiet reminder that working ranches operate according to responsibilities very different from suburban neighborhoods. As the evening sun settled behind the rolling Texas hills, I realized the strongest boundary had never been the steel gate standing across the gravel road. It had been the willingness of every honest person involved to finally accept that respect for another person's land begins long before the first tire ever reaches the fence line. Several months later the new public connector road officially opened beneath a bright Texas sky, and for the first time since this entire journey began, every vehicle traveling between the subdivision and the county highway did so without crossing a single foot of the Bennett Ranch. County officials, engineers, and construction crews gathered for a brief inspection before removing the final temporary traffic barriers. I stood quietly near the edge of my pasture watching the steady line of morning commuters disappear along the newly completed roadway. There was no celebration waiting for me because I had never wanted one. The only thing I had hoped for was a solution built on truth instead of assumption. The old gravel ranch road returned to the purpose it had always served. Ranch trucks carried feed, fencing supplies, and equipment between grazing fields while cattle moved peacefully from one pasture to another exactly as they had for generations. Titan continued spending his days beneath the broad branches of the old live oak tree where the cool afternoon shade stretched across the grass. Visitors who received permission still admired him safely from behind the secure livestock fencing, often commenting on how calm such an enormous animal appeared. I usually smiled because Titan had unknowingly become the symbol everyone remembered from the dispute, even though he had never been the cause of the conflict. The real lesson had always been about respecting the fence that protected both people and livestock long before anyone imagined using the ranch as a shortcut. A week after the new road opened, Linda stopped by the ranch one final time. She parked outside the gate instead of driving beyond it, walked toward the entrance, and waited until I reached her. The difference between our first meeting and our last could not have been clearer. Instead of carrying demands, she carried a small framed photograph taken during the construction of the new connector road, showing county workers, engineers, and residents standing together after the final inspection. She handed it to me and quietly thanked me for remaining patient even when the situation became difficult. She admitted that serving a community also meant accepting responsibility when mistakes were uncovered instead of defending them forever. I thanked her for helping guide the neighborhood toward a lawful solution once the facts became clear. As she drove away using the new public roadway, I realized neither of us had truly defeated the other. The only thing that lost was an assumption that should never have replaced verified records. Later that evening I climbed the familiar ridge overlooking the ranch carrying my grandfather's original deed inside its worn leather case. The sunset painted the rolling hills with deep shades of gold while the wind carried the scent of cedar, fresh hay, and warm earth across the open pasture. I unfolded the deed one final time beside the newly certified survey. Decades separated those two documents, yet every boundary remained exactly the same. My grandfather often said that land remembers every honest hand that cares for it, and standing there above the ranch, I finally understood what he meant. Ownership is not proven by raising your voice or winning an argument. It is proven by protecting what has been entrusted to you with patience, responsibility, and respect for the law. As darkness slowly settled across the Texas horizon, Titan lowered his head to graze peacefully beyond the fence, the steel gate stood quietly where it belonged, and the only shortcut anyone needed from that day forward was the simple truth that respecting another person's property will always lead to a better destination than taking the easy road through it.